Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. Today's Monday, October 28th, 2019. Today, we're going to be wrapping up Chapter 7, Ethical, Social, and Political Issues in E-Commerce. Everyone, please remember, let's take a look at where we're at in the class. So last week, Chapter 7 homework was assigned. It was complete questions 2, 4, 8, 9, 12, 15, and 16 from the end of Chapter 7. So this week we're going to have Chapter 7 homework due. So this homework's going to be due this week. We're going to finish up this chapter today. As I said, it won't be a long lesson today as we don't have much to cover. Moving at a really good pace in this class. Then we're going to move on to Chapter 8. And obviously Chapter 8 homework will be assigned this week as well. So that's just a little bit of where we're at in the class. Okay, so today we're going to be picking up with net neutrality, and we're going to be starting on page 293. Last class we left off with taxation, so issues concerning taxation of these e-commerce sales. And everyone just bear with me, I have a head cold today, so I apologize about that. So net neutrality. Net neutrality is more a political slogan than a concept. It means different things to different people. Now, at the current time, all internet traffic is treated equally or neutrally, and this treatment is seen by the internet backbone owners, and the fact that all activities in terms of word processing, emailing, video downloading, music and video files are charged the same flat rate regardless of how much bandwidth is used. So here we're saying that these companies, it's a neutral agreement here, so no matter what the service is or what you're downloading here, no matter how much bandwidth you're using, it's the same price no matter what. It's a flat rate. Now, the telephone and cable companies that provide the internet backbone would obviously like to be able to charge differentiated prices based on the amount of bandwidth that is consumed by the content being delivered over the internet. So these cable companies would rather charge a differentiated rate other than just a flat rate. It makes sense because obviously they would generate more revenue, especially with all the media downloads and the high bandwidth capacity for video downloads, video streaming, and stuff of that sort. It would generate much more revenue, so obviously they would want to do that. The carriers claim they need to introduce differential pricing in order to properly manage and finance their networks. So once again, it all comes down to revenue. So if they're talking about managing and financing their networks, then obviously at the end of the day, it all comes down to the cash flow. They want more money. So the carriers claim that there are three basic ways to achieve a rationing of bandwidth using the pricing mechanism. The three different basic ways start with the cap plans, also known as tiered plans. The second one is usage metering, and the third being a highway or toll pricing. So these are the three basic ways to achieve the rationing of bandwidth using the pricing mechanisms. So now we'll get into each one of these pricing mechanisms and see what they each are. So cap pricing, also known as tiered plans, are plans that place a cap on usage. So a good example that the book gives is, say, 300 gigabytes a month in a basic plan, and you could have more bandwidth available, and say 50 gigabyte chunks for an additional $50 a month. So that's just an example. So they're in tiered, the cap pricing. They give you a base amount, and then if you want to purchase more bandwidth, then you do that in increments or different caps or different tiers. I'm sorry. So the additional increments can be formalized as tiers, where users agree to purchase additional tiers for an additional amount of money, as we just said. So speed tiers is charging more for a higher speed internet service. So there's a direct relationship there as far as the speed tiers with cap pricing in a way, because if you're charging more for different tiers, obviously because you're using more bandwidth, then speed tiers is charging more for higher speed internet service. Because obviously we know in order to obtain a higher speed internet service, then we have to have a greater bandwidth in order for the information to flow to us at a more rapid rate. So speed tiers is just charging more for higher speed internet service. An alternative to cap plans is metered or usage-based billing. Usage-based billing is charging on the basis of metered units of internet service. So just basing it upon how much you use, pretty much, is the usage-based billing. One variation on metering is congestion pricing, where the price of bandwidth goes up at peak times. So congestion pricing, meaning when most people would want to be on the internet or would be on the internet, for example, on Saturdays or Sundays, maybe from 6 to 12 is an example that the book gives, when people would want to be downloading or streaming music or movies or series of whatever sort it might be, whatever type of media that you're looking at. So congestion pricing is charging a higher rate in times of peak usage amongst consumers. Now, a third pricing model is highway or toll pricing. This is where the firms that use high levels of bandwidth for their business pay a toll based on their usage of the internet. Now, highway pricing is a common way for governments to charge trucking companies based on the weight of their vehicles to compensate for the damage that heavy vehicles inflict on roadways. So that's one of the areas that the name comes from with the highway toll pricing. Is once again charging service providers, and a good example is Netflix, because we know Netflix enables us to stream these series and telephone or series and music and games or whatever it might be that's offered through Netflix. So charging service providers like Netflix for their use of the internet based on their bandwidth use. So they're going to charge these companies based on how much bandwidth they're actually using. Now, obviously, that these big companies like Netflix, when they're being charged for their services, obviously they're going to pass it on to the consumer, just as in any other industry does. They always pass the buck on onto the consumer. So plans to ration bandwidth are usually controversial, and in some cases even bring legal, regulatory, and political scrutiny. A good example is in September 2007, Comcast, which was the largest ISP in the United States, began to slow down traffic and specific websites using the BitTorrent protocol. And this was because the video users were consuming huge chunks of the Comcast network capacity during peak load times. Now, Comcast claims its policy was a legitimate effort to manage capacity. However, in August 2008, the Federal Communications Commission, known as the FCC, disagreed with Comcast and ordered them to stop discriminating against certain websites. Now, in April 2010, a federal appeals court ruled that Comcast had the right to manage its own network, including even charging some users more bandwidth or slowing more for bandwidth or slowing down certain traffic, such as BitTorrent files. So public interest groups have filed suits against the FCC for not going far enough to regulate ISPs. And their claim for coming against the FCC is that they're claiming that allowing ISPs to manage their networks, it will reduce the innovation of the internet. Now, supporters of the FCC net neutrality regulations, they're going to argue that without net neutrality, Netflix or Hulu customers might find their cable company blocking internet access to online streaming video from Netflix in order to force the customers or the consumers to use the cable company's on-demand movie rental platform as opposed to Netflix. So the supporters of the FCC are saying that the net neutrality regulations, we need this because without it, as we said, these cable companies would become monopolies and would actually control what we could do and what we could use the internet for, as far as streaming capabilities of service providers like Netflix and Hulu and stuff of that sort. Is what they're saying. They would totally cut that off to where you would have to use their service as opposed to that, because obviously the cable company would make a much larger profit if you were streaming them or using their on demand as opposed to Netflix. Now, in the end, net neutrality is about generating revenue for content distributors and internet service providers. So obviously, as we said before, it's all about the money coming into this firm. How much money can these firms generate? Next section is 7.5, Public Safety and Welfare. We're on the bottom of page 295 for those that are following along in the text. So electronic media of all kinds, meaning the telephone or telegraph, radio, and television, have usually been regulated by governments seeking to develop a rational commercial telecommunications environment and to control the content of the media. Now, newspapers and print media have been a little bit differently treated. They've usually been beyond the government controls because of the constitutional guarantees of freedom of speech. So the newspapers and printed media have a different approach from government because of the constitutional right of freedom of speech. On the other hand, electronic media, such as radio and television, have always been subject to content regulation because they use the publicly owned frequency spectrum. So obviously, if the public owns it, they have a say-so in what can go over the frequencies. Now, telephones have also been regulated as public utilities and common carriers with special social burdens to provide service and access, but with no limitations on content. So what's the trend we're seeing here? So if you're using a channel or a medium that is publicly owned, or just any sort that you're using to get your message out, that if you have to use a medium that's publicly owned, then they can monitor or screen the content that they want to be displayed on there, and rightfully so, because they own the medium in which the content is being exchanged. On the other hand, if you own a newspaper press like the Washington Post or the New York Times, something of that sort, then you have freedom of speech, so you can pretty much publish pretty much whatever you want because of the constitutional right of the First Amendment. Now, in the United States, critical issues in e-commerce center around the protection of children, strong sentiments against pornography in any public media, efforts to control gambling, and the protection of public health through restricting sales of drugs and cigarettes. So next we'll get into protecting children. So obviously, it says here pornography is an immensely successful internet business. It says that in 2012 it generated more than $3 billion in revenue. Now, to control the web as a distribution medium for pornography, in 1996, Congress passed the Communications Decency Act, known as the CDA. Now, this act made it a felony criminal offense to use any telecommunications device to transmit any comment, request, suggestion, proposal, image, or other communications which is obscene to any persons under the age of 18 years. Now, in 1997, the Supreme Court struck down the CDA as an unconstitutional abridgment of freedom of speech protected by the First Amendment. In 2001, Congress passed the Children's Internet Protection Act, known as the CIPA, which requires schools and libraries in the United States to install technology protection measures, also known as filtering software. And this was done in an effort to shield children from pornography. Another thing, in 1998, the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act, known as COPPA, C-O-P-P-A, is going to prohibit websites from collecting information on children under the age of 13. It does not permit such data collection, or it does, I'm sorry, it does permit for these companies to collect data from people under the age of 13 if they have that of parental consent. Now, responding to the changes in technology and public pressure, the FTC announced a new set of rules in early September 2012. The new rules seek to prohibit online trafficking of children across the web with cookies or any other technology such as persistent identifiers. Also prohibit ad networks from following children across the web and advertising them without parental consent, and make clear that mobile devices are subject to COPPA, including games and software apps, and make clear that third-party data collections from firms that collect data on websites are responsible for any unlawful data collection. Obviously, these new rules will have an effect on Facebook users, even though Facebook does not allow, per se, these underage users on their networks. We know that there are underage users on that network, so that will have a direct impact on how users under the age of 13 can actually interact on that website, or how Facebook can collect data on these underage users. Now, next concern is the cigarettes, gambling, and drugs. So is the web really borderless? And right now I'm on the bottom of page 297 with cigarettes, gambling, and drugs. So in the United States, both the states and the federal government have adopted legislation to control certain activities and products in order to protect public health and welfare. Now, cigarettes, gambling, medical drugs, and of course addictive recreational drugs are either banned or tightly regulated by the federal and state laws. These products and services are ideal for distribution over the internet through e-commerce sites, and mainly so because the sites can be located offshore. They can operate beyond the jurisdiction of state and federal prosecutors. So that's what we see a lot of times, is a lot of these firms will just locate off-site to where they're outside of the jurisdiction of the U.S. Now, gambling is going to provide an interesting example of the clash between traditional jurisdictional boundaries and claims to a borderless, uncontrolled web. So the online gambling market, based almost entirely offshore, is primarily located in the United Kingdom and various Caribbean islands. And it's going to generate as much as $50 billion to $60 billion a year, with much of the action coming from customers based in the United States. Now, in August 2006, Congress passed the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act, which makes it a crime to use credit cards or online payment systems for internet betting. So the passage of the Unlawful Internet Gambling Enforcement Act pretty much effectively barred online gambling companies from operating legally in the United States. It also led to a couple of the number of the leading publicly trading companies to suspend their business in the United States. So obviously this law really put a hurt on this online gambling thing they had going on. But by the end of 2011, the Justice Department reversed its stance against internet gambling and removed a major obstacle for states like New York and Illinois that want to legalize online gambling, ultimately so they can tax the proceeds. So in June 2012, the state of Delaware became the first state to legalize online gambling in all of its forms. And an interesting thing it says here is firms like Amazon and Facebook and Apple are supposedly developing online betting apps. So obviously this ties in with ethical issues here, where obviously we've always frowned on this. So now we see it coming to light that more more and more people are doing it, and the laws are starting to lean up on it or be more lenient, I guess you could say. So now, I guess that raises a big issue. So that's just some food for thought. What's your all's thoughts on these big power companies actually starting to get into this platform of online gambling? So pretty interesting stuff here. That does wrap up chapter 7, as I thought it would be a shorter class period. So once again, we just finished chapter 7. Please do your homework as it is due this week. Once again, chapter 7 homework is the questions 2, 4, 8, 9, 12, 15, and 16 from the end of chapter 7. It is listed in Moodle. So that is it for today. Everyone have a good day, and I will see everyone on Monday, and we will start chapter 8.